meaningful university community partnerships, advancing critical action-oriented research for social justice. Our speakers are Dr. Antunes, Dr. Adrienne Cachelin, and Kim Yapias. It's virtual, so it's being recorded. Please turn off your camera and mute yourself for the best experience. And please put your questions in the chat feature or unmute yourself when you are invited by the speaker. This is a QR code to our event evaluation. We'd love for everybody to fill that out, but particularly UROP scholars, in order to receive credit for attending this event, you'll need to fill this out after the session. And I'd like to read the mission for the Office of Undergraduate Research. It is to facilitate and promote undergraduate, student, faculty, collaborative research and creative works in all disciplines throughout the University of Utah campus. In recognition that excellence requires diversity, we pursue this mission through equitable programming that promotes diverse representation and social justice. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have Dr. Ana Antunes. She is an assistant professor in gender studies. We have Dr. Adrienne Cachelin. She's a professor in environmental and sustainability studies. And we have Kim Yapias, and she's with the Community Research Collaborative. So now I will turn it over to you.
And then I'm going to share my screen right now. Let's see. Can everybody see that? Okay. Okay, awesome. Well, welcome everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And we are the Community Research Collaborative. And today we're going to talk about meaningful university community partnerships. More specifically, advancing critical action-oriented research for social justice. Let's see. And just a little introduction to us. We are like I said, we are the Community Research Collaborative, and this is a group that varies around like 22 participants depending on the year. And in this group, there are members from like the community, whether it's from nonprofits, different community partnerships, organizations, and we also have members from the university. And what we all have in common is that we have some type of experience in community-based research, whether that's being in that partnership from the community side or initiating that research and partnership relationship from the university side. And now we're just each one of us is going to talk about ourselves.
I am Ana Antunes, and I am assistant professor in gender studies.
And I'm Adrienne Cachelin, and I am a faculty member with the Environmental and Sustainability Studies program. We are playing with an environmental justice lab and thinking about how to do community-based environmental justice work in the community.
And I am Kimberly Yapias, and I am the Community Research Collaborative Coordinator, but I also work at Wasatch Community Gardens. Over here is an overview of what we're going to go through today. So we're going to start with the foundations of community-based research and what that is, so that everybody is on the same page. And then we're going to transition into what meaningful partnerships, what NCBR look like, and then a couple case studies from Adrienne and Anna. And then we're going to talk about outputs of community research collaborative that we have made throughout the past year. And then we're going to end with like how strong partnerships work towards social justice.
Okay, so first we're just gonna start talking a little bit about the theoretical foundations of community-based research, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and to make sure that we're all starting from the same place, right? What is community-based research, right? There are a couple important things that we want to talk about. Community-based research, it's not about just understanding issues, right? Researching issues, but it's also about implementing solutions, right? And the way we do that is through working with our partners, right? And focusing on questions that are meaningful to the community. In order to engage people meaningfully, we need to think about power structures and the way that they, influence the process of working with community-based research, right? So I want to talk a little bit about, as you can see on that word cloud that was just there, there's lots of different ways that people think about and talk about community-based research. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the ways that they came to be, right? And when we talk about community-based research, we usually talk about two different strands, the northern strand and the southern strand. And we're talking mostly about the global south and the global north, right? So thinking more about like positionalities of oppressors and oppressed versus being geographically on the north and the south, right? One important distinction between the two strands, the northern strand, it's came to be mostly around improving processes, right, in organizations like factories and schools, which I'll talk about in a minute. The southern strand really has sort of a more liberatory approach. It came from, like I said, oppressed groups, and really thinking about community-based research as a way to engage folks in the struggles for liberation. So they both started at about the same time. The southern strain a little bit earlier, with a Highland Folk School here in the US, in the Appalachia region, where they created these schools as a tool for learning. And as you may know, the Highlands Folk School became a really important center for training of civil rights activists here in the United States, and they used community-based research processes to do that. The Northern Strength started with Kurt Lewin, who was a organization psychologist, and he was looking at ways to improve production at a factory, right? And he did a research, he conducted a research that today sounds really obvious to us, what the result would be. But in the 40s was really groundbreaking when they were thinking about improving or changing the ways that the factory worked. He divided the factory workers into three groups. And one group was just told how things were going to change and told how they were going to work from now on. A second group was told how they were going to work, but they could get input to the directions that they were given. And then the third group was able to be involved in creating the changes that were going to be put in place. And like I said, it may seem really obvious to us today, but the third group was the group that was that performed better, was the group that was happier happiest with their jobs, and the group that had no input whatsoever on how the changes were going to be implemented was were the least happier. So from there, he realized the importance of engaging folks in organizational research. That path continue in England as well, with like teacher as researchers, like action research in the classroom, to develop curriculum reform and things like that. So that strand is still really used in like to apply or to create organizational change. But our focus here is more on the Southern strength, which focused on, like I said, laboratory practice and social change, right? There are a couple things that I just want to highlight there. Paulo Freire is a really important person, and when we talk about the Southern strain of CBR, he developed what we call critical pedagogy to teach adults to read in Brazil. And he recognized that when people were learning about their environment, right, they were more likely to participate, and that education could be a tool for liberation. Fausto Borda was also a really important person. He was a sociology professor at the National University of Colombia, and then he started to work with the National Farm Work Association. And as he started to work with them, he realized that he knew very little about their realities. So he left his job at the university. He lived and worked with the farm workers for 20 years, so he could actually learn and experience what their lives, and then went back to the university after that. But he really recognized that division between, like, that the experience of the farm workers was the expertise he needed to do the work that he was doing. There are a couple more folks in India and in Tanzania that really help shape the way community-based research is understood today.
Okay, so with a little history of kind of this movement that has been around for so long, I just want to revisit the different parts and think about them in the context of today. So when we're thinking about community-based research, we're not just thinking about sort of objective, let's see what's out there research that, you know, is only supposed to inform policy in some ways, but maybe not really be based in social change the way that community-based research is. And the pieces of that are critical theory. Anna talked about critical pedagogy. I know a lot of times when we hear the word critical, we think about critical thinking hard about something. Critical theory is a little bit more specific to really looking at and trying to understand power relationships. And if you think about the title of this talk and the idea of building meaningful relationships, certainly recognizing that being a part of the University of Utah or in an academic position, whether it's as a faculty member or a student, there's a certain amount of power that comes with that. And so when we think about participation, we think about how it is that we can work with folks in an equitable and respectful way, and to make knowledge that's often held behind a paywall in journals something that's more available, something that's more relevant, something that's, you know, more actionable, which leads us to this next idea. Again, that knowledge is not something that we create only to sort of expand conversation within an academic field or discipline, but that we also think about how that knowledge can create change. And then finally, the accessible results part comes from a different history of research that was sort of extractive in the context of communities, where researchers would come in and do a bunch of studies. They would be the only ones to get paid and in the process of this research, and then they would leave and take the results with them. And in the projects and case studies that you'll hear about, really the community facing products, the folks that we have been working with are the ones that really set kind of what are some of the necessary outcomes, and how do we move this work forward from their perspective, from a community perspective. And it's kind of an interesting, it calls on us to do some interesting work, right? There's sort of this perspective shift of being the folks who know, who have studied something for a long time, who are sort of credentialed. You know, I think society values that knowledge so heavily, and we're not very good at valuing the knowledge of folks whose lived experience is related to what we want to better understand. And so there's this moment of sort of challenging and recognizing where knowledge comes from, and that it can come from both places, and that actually when we're talking about solving problems, that both pieces, both types of knowledge are really valid. And I think the only way to have a meaningful partnership, as with any relationship, right, is this moment of respect, and of even understanding that respect really comes from saying out loud what each person brings. And I have made some mistakes with this in the past of thinking that, you know, I can show up authentically in a space and listen, but I was sort of timid actually about sharing what I brought. And so finding that sort of baseline between, or working spot, sweet spot between humility and what you bring can sometimes be pretty challenging, but I think it's a key part of really being part of a long-term relationship. So when we talk about then the creation and maintenance of these sort of longer term partnerships, and moving beyond that, take some data and get out kind of perspectives, one of the really important pieces is investing time. And in one of the case studies I'm going to talk about, we are in a partnership that has lasted about 20 years. And it's really gone to a place where it's conversations that will yield projects, as opposed to one of us sort of coming with an idea. And I think a lot of that comes from following through with results, with community products, with knowing from the start, you know, what is it that we're going to work together on. And I think oftentimes we think that working together means that everybody does everything. Sometimes that works great. Other times it's better when people sort of work into their own strengths, right? So on the right side, you see this increasing level of involvement from sort of doing an outreach project, or even being a consultant. You know, sometimes people will approach us in different communities to say, hey, can you help us figure this thing out? And that's a type of community-based research for sure. And especially if it's intended to bring some sort of change or inform policy. But there are other projects where that really strong shared leadership position is really important, and includes all of these different pieces about decision making and how you're going to form those partnership structures. There are some tools, some resources we'll share at the end, with a really helpful partnership agreement to kind of, when you begin a project, take you through it so that you can articulate, where do we want this to be? And again, it's not saying that one thing is better than another. It's just recognizing that different projects call for different approaches and different ways that a partnership will function.
Adrienne was talking a little bit about the challenges of and the benefits of community-based research, right? So I think there are a couple other points that I want to make about things that can make community-based research hard, that we usually don't think about before we start, right? I think one of the things that it's sometimes implied that it's easy to understand is what community means, right? I think a lot of times when we think about community, we think about a geographical area, but community can be much more than that. and we need to think about who is defining who is a member of that community, and who is defining who's not a member of that community, and who is making those decisions, and why those decisions are being made, and sort of think, critically, like about the boundaries of a community and who is a part of it or not. Adrienne just showed you the different levels of participation, the continuum of participation. So defining that participation, it's often hard, it's often a challenge. That's a conversation that needs to happen before the project starts, right? It needs to be really clear what kind of participation you were talking about and who is going to do what, right? Another important part is, everywhere we go in our community, we go with our the weight of the University of Utah as an institution, right? Regardless of what we do here. And that weight can make things really uneven, right? Like power hierarchy really uneven. So it's really important that we recognize that and make it clear in our conversations with our partners, that we understand that there's a difference, and that we recognize it, and that what are we gonna do to mitigate that. Defining priorities can also be a challenge. Oftentimes our priorities is not our community partners' priorities, and so it's really important to have a conversation about what's going to happen and what's going to get done first, and what are the constraints of the work, right? And then really being clear about whose priorities are the priority, and they should be your partner, right? Other couple things here is just that community-based studies are usually hard to replicate. You can use similar tools and you can use similar strategies in other communities, but because communities are unique and you all are unique as researchers, each study is going to be different, right? Even if you're working, if Adrienne and I are working with the same people, the project that's going to come out of what Adrienne is doing is going to be very different than the project that I'm going to work with the same folks, because we're just different people and we engage with our partners in different ways, right? It's not better or worse, it's just different. And then just thinking about cultural humility and coming into communities knowing that you are there to learn, and you're not there to teach, right? And so really recognizing your role as a learner there.
Sorry. So now that we went over kind of the theory and foundations of what community-based research is, it's time to turn into how to turn that into a real life meaningful partnership. There was, I think earlier in this series, there was a specific webinar presentation about the guiding principles of CBR, but we still wanted to mention it here. And for those who are new with this, in 2021, I believe, the Community Research Collaborative created the guiding principles of community-based research. And the main goal of this is to be a resource for researchers that have specific guidelines and principles of how to create that meaningful partnership, and the many factors that maybe you want to know first experiencing what it's like to do CBR work. And here are our 6 guiding principles right here. And on the upper right-hand corner is a QR code to these guiding principles with more resources and information. We wanted to do, since this presentation is about meaningful relationships, we wanted to do a principle highlight specifically on equitable collaboration. And what this principle is, it talks about who decides what is equitable collaboration. So when it's a meaningful partnership, this usually this partnership shares ownership of the research. So it's not, which shows like the shift in power dynamic and also the shift in perspective that we talked about in the previous slides, that shared ownership really is impactful with how the project goes and also what happens after the project, and also the impact on the community. Another thing is equitable distribution of work. So that's really, that goes with that communication part of a equitable collaboration, talking to your community partner about what is their strengths or interests, and then what is yours, and then like how can your two strengths in working be combined to make something that is equitable. For example, if you're working in research at a school and collaborating with a principal who has a lot of many different things that they also have to do, and like this, it's very important to talk to that person to see like what their capacity is, and like even it out with what your capacity is, and not assume capacities or what people can do. The last part is identifying strengths between you and your partner, which I already kind of talked about, but that's a big part in that communication process. And the last thing is a really easy way to start that conversation with your community partner to make it super meaningful right from the start is to create that partnership agreement together that answers all of those questions, so that everyone that you are working with knows like what the whole idea and project is and who is doing what.
All right, so I am going to talk to you all a little bit about Youth Voices. Youth Voices is a youth participatory action research program at UNP's Heartland Partnership Center, and is been developed to increase the educational opportunities for young people on the southwest side of Salt Lake County. We are located in Glendale, however, really close to the West Valley border there. So we have some students who are in West Valley as well. And it's a program that's been going on since 2015. I've been involved with it since 2019. And it's a program that places young people's expertise at the center of knowledge production and help marginalize, and it creates a space for marginalized youth to recognize themselves as knowledge holders and knowledge producers, right? So we every year we start in the fall semester with having conversations and learning about issues in the community, and then in the spring we develop a research project. This semester we're working on 2 projects. They're usually arts-based projects. This semester we're working on 2 documentary films, one about navigating young people who are navigating their parents' immigrant culture and their Americanized experience, and how they deal with that. And then another one thinking about school settings and how racism and discrimination appears in schools. So
this case study is a project that actually grew out of 2 distinct community-based research projects that were happening at the same time. One project was related to understanding what was going on with urban agriculture and farms. And the other one was about trying to understand sense of belonging and how to enhance sense of belonging. And it kind of happened in the context of COVID-19, when one of the things that became really clear was, when everyone was initially in shutdown, there were still folks that had to leave their homes and go find food at schools. And that was kind of the thing that made us go, okay, we need to merge these 2 pieces of research. We know that community gardens have been known almost more for building community than they have been for growing food. And we also know that there's this issue around food sovereignty or food justice in this area that we were working with, the Glendale Community Learning Center. And these two things came together so that we put together a project where we could enhance access to the University of Utah by collaboratively designing a summer program around urban agriculture. We paired a university instructor with a couple of parents who were bringing different cultural foodways kind of to the fore, both in terms of what was being grown and how to cook those things. So students actually in a 3-week program, 3 of those days were spent with parents in the kitchen from different cultures and backgrounds, learning how to cook these foods. With our partners, we designed some prompts about how we could measure sense of belonging and sense of place to see if we had students work in urban agriculture settings, from mutual aid gardens to school gardens in their own zip codes, to then working on campus at our campus gardens. Could we sort of change up sense of belonging and make people feel that they belonged more by using the garden, by doing this sort of reciprocal gardening program? Our community partners led the recruitment part. We are conducting the analysis. We only piloted one element of this project last year, and we're going to pilot the next couple phases of it this year. And this was actually funded this year by the VPR's office, the Community-Based Research Implementation grant. So we're excited to see how that pans out. It was just a really nice example. The reason I wanted to share it is because it was an example of where this sort of communication and partnership from the very beginning was, hey, we've got this going on, we've got this going on, what can we do? A bunch of us sitting in the room, let's try this. Let's see if we can make this work out in this context. And we can talk about that more when we have Q&A if anyone's curious about that project.
So now that we kind of came from like theory to seeing like that process of how like a meaningful partnership works and to real life examples of it, that might seem intimidating maybe as like an undergrad, or maybe going through that first round of creating a community-based research project. But this here, I want to show y'all that there are resources and tools that can really help, like maybe ease the stress or help guide to something that is, to a project that is going to be successful with that change in perspective of like community partnerships. The first resource that I want to talk to you about, which all of these were projects from Community Research Collaborative, is that we have a grant restructure that that we helped with, talk to the Vice President of Research Office to have a grant specifically for community-based research. With community-based research and building relationships, we understood that it takes time, that it might not, you might not get that desired product in 1 year because you're spending that intentional time working on that meaningful relationship and learning about the community. So with this shift, we created a 2-year grant for community-based research with that understanding of that first year is going to be that community relationship building piece, and that second year is going to be that community-based project portion of it. And another thing that we did that has to do with the CBR grants is that we also created a research education or RED course that helps researchers really dive into these guiding principles of CBR so that they have a intentional understanding of it while they create their research proposal. And we also have a QR code to our website. And in this website contains all the resources that we've talked about. And also the goal of this website is to be not only a network for community-based researchers here in Salt Lake County, but also to our community partners that we worked with, to highlight and show that CBR projects like are happening in Salt Lake, and also those theoretical and resource tools that like we talked about that's actually like on the website. So QR code's right there. Another project I want to talk about is that last year we created the with the help of like these members on the picture, we developed the West Side Community Review Board. And this is similar to an IRB, but it's community focused and community based. And the main mission of it is that this board is going to advise on and review research done in the West Side Salt Lake County neighborhoods, so in communities. And one of their goals is to ensure that studies are carried out in collaboration with and the benefit of West Side communities. So that gives like that real deep perspective piece to these projects that maybe there hasn't been a review board like this before. And as you're going through your journey of creating these research projects or going into research, this can be a resource as project support, because you can submit your research proposal to the West Side Community Review Board, and we'll do an initial consult of your project and do a full review to maybe highlight some factors that are based, all of it is based on the 6 guiding principles of CBR.
Yeah, and I think, when we go to this big picture level, when we start to think the whys about community-based research, I think there's a few whys. More and more, we're actually seeing funders ask for how different proposals, forefront or put equity at the forefront. And I think doing community-based research, if we're really sort of thinking about power and sharing power, I think that's one reason that many folks turn to community-based research these days, is that there's sort of a prompt, which is kind of a cool thing when we think about how research is shaped and sort of who shapes research at the broadest level. But I think another reason that folks get involved in it is really thinking about how we can work towards social justice. I mean, I don't know how many of you in the last few days, when it's been so brutally cold, have thought about all the folks who are experiencing homelessness right now, and how do we change that up? How do we go to sleep, knowing that there are folks who don't have what we have, and so working towards doing research that actually works towards some type of equity really depends on these meaningful partnerships, really depends on listening, and try to better understand what are the barriers for folks that are so hidden from folks who aren't experiencing those barriers. And a lot of times that listening is really sort of cultivated through various projects and programs. So with Anna's program, there's a quote from one of the Youth Voices participants who talks about how that program made them more comfortable with speaking out and knowing that they're heard and feeling like their opinion matters, and sort of expanding their reach of who they consider family. So I think there's this real moment of recognizing that as a university, as an R1 university, we do a lot of research, and how can we think about using that research towards something that amplifies marginalized voices, and that informs how we can create systems that work for everybody. I don't know, Anna, Kim, anything to add to that?
I think we can talk more about it when we go to the questions. I know we've been a little bit over time, so if people have more questions about how those different partnerships work, then we can talk about that then.
I have some questions if other folks don't, but I want to make space for anyone else.
Yeah, you can go ahead and then it's open conversation.
Cool. I've heard a lot of discussion recently, particularly through our climate change action plan, community engagement process that I've been, a part of, around the need to make sure that some community engaged research is sort of facilitated on a higher level, so that it's not like every individual researcher trying to connect with, some council or organization or group that might be already overburdened. And I'm wondering sort of what your guidance is on like individuals pursuing community engaged work, like if you're a student or a faculty member who's just getting going on this, versus like connecting to various resources and communities where those relationships are kind of already established, and the issue of not wanting to put a burden on folks in communities where like their job isn't to facilitate our research, right? They've got other things to do. So I wondered if you could speak about that a little bit.
The thing that occurs to me, Brenda, is that for a while we've been trying to get some buy-in for some larger organizational systems to kind of know who's doing what in what spaces, and there's a lot of good software to do it. And so I know one of the goals of the Community Research Collaborative in the next couple of years is to get that, and the only thing that's in our way right now is funding. So I think that that's one piece of your question, because I hear you. It seems like, we're not thinking that this is the right research path for everyone necessarily. And especially given that lots of times structurally, we're the only ones getting paid to do the research, right? And then so even in that, we recognize and support people, support partners in this research, and generate funding so that we can pay partners in this research. It still doesn't necessarily mean that we're not taking people away from what they're actually supposed to be doing and what their job actually is. So I think that the notion of some larger, broader sort of at least knowing who's doing what, so that your first step could be to plug into something existing rather than create something new, would be a great step. And Kim and Anna, I'd love to hear what y'all think as well.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, that's the part that it's important about a meaningful partnership, right? Like it's not like, and when we talk about like equitable partnerships, we're not necessarily talking about like splitting the work half and half, right? Or splitting the work or whatever. It's really about doing what's best for that community and that project, and that sometimes may be that you are, you're meeting with them and you're talking to them, but you may be doing most of the work, and that's okay, because if that's how the community, right, if they say like, we really don't have capacity to engage in any way other than like meet with you once a month to see how things are going, like that is that you're doing something that is benefiting your partner and making equitable in terms of like who can do the work and what people feel comfortable with. So I think sometimes too, when we think about community engaged research, is what you were saying, we think about like training every person to be a researcher, and that's great, and sometimes that works perfectly, right? And sometimes that's amazing, but other times it's just impossible, and then we just have to like figure out a different way to make sure that we're building meaningful partnerships with our partners, but also being thoughtful about their time and their capability.
I think one last part to add is just really thinking about that understanding of shared strengths. And like, for example, maybe you have a community partner who has known like the community for like over 20 years, but at the same time, maybe they work in the Salt Lake City school district or a school that keeps them like pretty much at full time. But one of their strengths could be having the trust of like those families in that school. So I think just that communication part and knowing like, oh, okay, like maybe my partner doesn't have the specific time to do this, but then they also have like the trust, and then I can do the work in developing like this like figuring out what questions we want to ask the families, and like them helping to organize, like having the families in like in a little like room or gathering people. And Annie?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if you all could reflect on, because often I think what I'm hearing, excuse me, is about how you're building relationships, building partnerships and all of that. But I also want to tap in that maybe some of our folks have partnerships in our community that we've never thought about them as sites of knowledge, as as our community, as our partners. And teaching in ethnic studies, that's some of the things that I think with my students about is how, it could be in the everyday of their own families. And so how might you all kind of help us think about those kind of community partnerships that we may already have, that it's not something out there, but there's something that we are already a part of, that that our students are a part of. So, and have you worked on projects like that? So can you maybe speak to that? I'd love to hear more about the community partnerships that may be right within us.
Yeah, I feel like high school students, particularly high school students of color, of refugee and immigrant background, which are the students that I work with at Youth Voices, you usually fall onto this place that people don't think about as being a site of knowledge or a place where people hold knowledge. And I think it's really important to recognize that everybody has knowledge, and that our communities are full of really valuable things that often don't make it to the academia or academic journals and things like that, right? So I think one of the things that to me is really important to think about is also research in a broader sense of the word, and thinking about research projects as like not necessarily as the way we traditionally think about research projects, but thinking about what is something that would be meaningful for folks. With Youth Voices, we use a lot of arts-based methods and arts-based frameworks, because that's something that is meaningful to the young people I'm working with, right? That's something that they are comfortable with. That's something that they can do and feel and enjoy. So really, like, thinking about research through a different lens, that's not the super traditional lens. I think that's really important too, because then it's a lot easier to engage folks, right? Like if folks in your family are I know that there's a lot of people who participate in like knitting circles or go to ceramics groups or have go to choir practice, or like all these places where people are together and are using these art forms to share knowledge and build community. These can be really important like ways to connect and to use that as a research tool.
I don't know if this gets exactly any to what you were asking, but what your question made me think of was that the first time I jumped into community engaged research was I was looking at maps of areas that the U.S. Department of Agriculture had areas that they had labeled as food deserts. And I had a couple of students, I was teaching a food justice class, and I had a couple of students who said they couldn't imagine what it would be like to not have food access and or to, you know, to live in these places where food wasn't available. And you know, it was really their question of like, what would this be like, that made us go to the Glendale Community Learning Center, which was identified in this map, to learn more about that area. And, you know, what ended up happening was this this moment of thinking of a place as somewhere that lacked access to food. Instead, we when we went to this when we went to the community learning center, the woman who was running it said, "Hey, you know, y'all should just come hang out here a little bit. And by the way, we've been trying to put together this cookbook for a really long time, and you know, we can't seem to get it going for a bunch of reasons." And so in this process of creating this community project that at the time I wasn't really thinking of as research, but instead it was just following our partner's lead on like, hey, help us make this thing, because we want to be able to highlight what's actually going on here that's related to food. That was sort of the beginning of a published book that really brought forward these knowledges that, you know, cultural foodways can act as resistance to marginalization. And so yeah, I don't know, for me it was the whole thing was very student driven.
We have a few more minutes. Any more questions?
Do we want to there's something in the chat, and I wonder if Anna wants to, other Anna, sorry, Anna Sanchez Burkhead, who put that in the chat. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, I can just elaborate a little bit, and it's just nice to meet everyone. I've really enjoyed the presentation. Wonderful knowledge and information. I was so impressed with all that you're doing, and how well you presented on community-based research. Definitely gave me some things to think about. At CCET, the Community Collaborative Engagement Team, we do work with researchers and community members, and bring them around the table to discuss research projects. And we really favor doing this at the early stage of the research cycle. Our community members appreciate being able to give their input to the design of how the research will be conducted. And I think there was a question asked about, you know, is there, you know, what do we need to consider for when approaching communities? And you probably know this as well. During the pandemic, a lot of our underserved, underrepresented, minoritized communities were bombarded with requests for research. And I think we heard that the moan and groan, you know, about especially from the University of Utah, you know, researchers wanting to come. And it was just a lot of funding to better understand the pandemic among these communities. And so I think there are some lingering woes about being involved in research, you know, from our communities. And yet it's so important. It is so important to get the voice of the community. So just wanted to you know, share that service is there for researchers who don't have access to many of these communities, don't have anyone that, no, they don't have those informants or those participants or those members of the community that can help. We do have a broad range of connections in rural areas, in you know, racially and ethnically diverse communities. So we do provide a lot of services in community engagement dialogues, which are like town halls, conducting interviews, conducting focus groups, developing community advisory boards. So we can do a lot of that for researchers that don't have those connections. So I don't know if that helps, but we've been doing this for a long time. And I think many of you probably are familiar with Community Faces of Utah, which is our community advisory board. They've got a wealth of experience and large connections among these communities. So, but thank you for this presentation. It was really wonderful.
Well, thank you very much, Adrienne, Anna, and Kimberly. It was a great presentation. We really appreciate it. Sending the evaluation form link in the chat. So we really love everybody's feedback, especially the Europe scholars, so they can get credit for the event. And just remember the Office of Undergraduate Research. We're at our.utah.edu. If you have any questions, let us know. Thank you again, ladies.